you for tuning in. I'm going to ask everybody, if you haven't done so already, to mute your microphone before I start so we don't get feedback in the course of this, because the more people that join, the more likely we are to get it. Also, I am going to basically disappear behind my PowerPoint here in just a minute, so that's probably going to uplift the aesthetic quality of the viewing, but I'll still be here, I assure you. All right, I'm going to get started here. I'm talking about the classical and British roots of the U.S. Congress. It's actually quite an interesting subject, and one that is often neglected in the curriculum. So hopefully it will be informative to some of you. Now, everybody knows a little something about Congress, I think, if for no other reason than we all saw this when we were growing up.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee. But I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
Well, as it happens, I'm just a bill, too. And I'm actually the substitute for Constitution Day. If Mother Nature will stop messing with us, we might do the rest of this year's fanfare season on campus. But because of the hurricane and because of various illnesses, we had to cancel one originally scheduled. So I am substituting and talking about a somewhat different topic than was originally announced several months ago. The U.S. Constitution says in Article 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. And of course, as you probably know, the Congress is the only truly representative branch of government. The president is still elected by the Electoral College, which means it's possible, as we've experienced several times in our history, to have a president who did not win the popular vote, but did win the Electoral College vote. The Supreme Court is, of course, appointed, although confirmed by the Senate. The Senate has been elected popularly since 1913 with the passage of the 17th Amendment, and the House always has been popularly elected since the adoption of the Constitution in 1787, but with some exceptions. You basically had to be a property-owning white male to vote for a long time. Prior to the Jacksonian reforms in the 1830s, the passage of the 19th Amendment enfranchising women in 1920, and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which provided opportunities for African Americans to vote. At any rate, where did the founders get the idea for having a Congress like the one we have? They didn't make it up out of whole cloth. They were good, but they did have examples that they worked with. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that the founders learned from history. They read history. This is Thomas Jefferson's library in Monticello right here. The man was a reader. And in fact, most of our founding fathers were that way. They were very much influenced by the Enlightenment, and via the Enlightenment, very much influenced by the classical world as well. You know, one of the myths about the founding fathers is that they agreed about everything. They did not. They disagreed just as much and often just as viciously as we disagree now. But they were disagreeing from a very learned perspective most of the time. So they got a lot of their ideas from history. And the roots of Congress go way back here, as Sherman and Mr. Peabody would let you know. You know I have to have at least one goofy gimmick in this thing, or it wouldn't be me. They go way back to the classical world, where our first example that heavily influenced the founding fathers comes from ancient Greece, and in particular, ancient Athens. By the 18th century, people knew a great deal about the ancient Greeks, thanks to the rediscovery of a great deal of literature about the ancient world during the Renaissance. And so people who had read this stuff were familiar with how things worked. Now, Athens is what I like to call the exemplary polis in ancient Greece. Greece was not a single state. It was a collection of city-states, the Greek word for which is polis, which is why we have towns called things like Indianapolis, or if you're a Superman fan, Metropolis. But at any rate, it is fairly typical of most Greek city-states, with one notable exception, in that it evolved from a monarchy into something resembling democracy over the course of its history. So for a brand new republic like the fledgling United States, which had just thrown off a monarchy and was seeking to establish a republican government, that's with a little r, it was a good example. Athens, traditionally, according to the Homeric version of things, comes out of the Dark Ages around 800 BC. We would talk about it in terms of the Bronze Age now. But by the middle of the 8th century, they had set up an alternative to royal power called the Council of the Areopagus, which used to meet where you see these people congregating in the picture on your screen. Now, the members of the Areopagus were by and large well-to-do. They made their living from agriculture, producing olive oil and that very lethal Greek wine, and they tended to have a lot of land and a lot of wealth. So this is not a democratic situation at all, with a little d, at the time. This is government really by a king and the well-to-do. But the well-to-do gradually got rid of royal power and became the principal source of political guidance for some time. Sometime in the 8th or early 7th centuries BC, they created a magistrate's position called archon. There were usually 9 of those. And we know about them because about 683 BC, there is a list that survives that lets us know who these people were. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all of them. About 621 BC, an archon by the name of Draco, as in Malfoy, produced the first written set of laws for Athens, which is quite early, much earlier than the Romans do, for example. These laws were rather harsh in nature, which is why we refer to laws that are harsh as draconian. But at any rate, there's a great advantage to having law written down, because then you know how to defend yourself if you're charged with something. The move towards democracy, or really what is accurately described as timocracy, begins during the time of a man by the name of Solon, who was appointed to carry out political reforms to avoid class conflict in Athens that had reached the point of being a threat to order. So in 594, he's given the position as the sole administrator of Athens and proceeds to do some things to involve a larger element of the population in the government. For one thing, he extends citizenship to people who were not already citizens, but who were living in Athens. The theory being that if you are a citizen, you will be more invested in the state, you will be loyal to it, and support it in times of trouble. He also created a new organ of government that looks a little bit like a Congress, a council of 400. You can probably guess why it's called that. which included representatives of the middle class, people who had money, but who up until this point hadn't had a lot of political authority to go along with it. He also created something, to use the Greek word, called the ecclesia, but since we use ecclesia to mean church, I'm going to switch that to assembly, which is what it really is, which is a group that represented the lower classes. At this juncture, the assembly still doesn't have a lot of power, but it opens the door for them getting that later on. He also created something that, for want of a better term, we can refer to as a Supreme Court. Now, it's not identical to the one that we have, but the purpose is much the same. This was a place where you could go if you didn't feel that you had gotten justice lower down the system of courts. And it's interesting that, our founders knew about Solon well enough that early on, the term Solon becomes a nickname for senators. Not sure how much that's used anymore. I'm not sure any of the people reporting about politics have read anything, but it used to be quite common. Then Athens went through a weird stage in its history called the time of tyrants. And I have to explain this word here. When we use the word tyrant, we don't mean anything complimentary about that. We use the word to describe people like Hitler and Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot and people who were brutal, basically above the law sort of dictators. That's not really what the tyrants are in Greece, or for that matter, in Rome. They rather were individuals who were appointed to deal with emergency situations. And one of the risks, of course, of appointing somebody to an all-powerful position in the face of an emergency is that they may not go away. And this is more or less what happened here. The first of the tyrants who came to power in Athens in 560 was a fellow by the name of Pisistratus, who was essentially a benevolent ruler. He ruled in the interests of the Athenian people, but he also ruled with more or less absolute power. And he passed that on to his son, whose name was Hippias. And Hippias was not a benevolent ruler. He abused his position and abused it to the point that in 510, the Athenians overthrew him and set out to carry out another series of reforms meant to further democratize their city-state. This time, the reforms were carried out by this fella, a very modern-looking guy, except for his clothing, by the name of Cleisthenes, who is often referred to in the history books as the father of democracy. The Greeks have a lot of these fathers: the father of science, the father of history, Herodotus. If you've ever seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding, you'll understand the dynamic that's at work. At any rate, in 508 BC, he began these reforms, which included expanding citizenship further, also creating a council of 500 that replaced the old council of 400, and that was chosen in a very interesting way. Rather than having candidates run for a position on the council of 500 and everybody vote, all the adult male citizens drew lots. That is, they had a lottery. And the 500 people who got the right draw became members of the council for the next year. Not sure that's all that terribly bad an idea. But anyway, that's how they did it. By this point, the assembly, which literally included all of the male citizens of Athens, had gotten a lot more power. Now, they could do this. We couldn't very well get 350 million people together in one place to vote on anything. But the assembly was still small enough that this was literally possible. And so they debated. They voted on issues sent to them by the council. They had the power to declare war or not to declare war. They had the power to appropriate money, and they had the power to audit government officials and make sure they were spending money the way they were supposed to. So they actually had quite a lot of authority by this point. And this is something we see later on in lower houses of two-house legislatures, and it's something we see a little bit in our own Congress. Now, Cleisthenes also introduced a rather odd practice, which just goes to show you that sometimes reformers have what looks like a good idea that maybe turns out not to be so good. This practice was called ostracism. Nowadays, if you ostracize somebody, that basically means you shut them out. There are certain religious groups, certain political groups that ostracize people that they don't believe are following the true path. But that's not what we really mean here. Ostracism was a legal process whereby Athens could decide if any particular political figure was becoming too popular, so popular that he might be a threat to become a tyrant, they could kick him out of the city for a decade. Now, it would certainly be hard to acquire very much power if you're not in the city for a decade. But think about this. Some of the people who become popular might do so by illicit means, but if you do a good job, you also might become popular. So the risk here is, first of all, that you will run people out of town who are good, and the other risk is that people will use this to go after their enemies, which they did. Athenian democracy is often said to have reached its perfection just before it fell off the edge of a cliff in the Peloponnesian War during the age of Pericles, who is not the father of democracy, and who seems to have in this the language that goes with Cleisthenes. So I'm just going to wing it here. Pericles is there when they expand the power of the assembly even more. They also create what is kind of a board of directors. They don't have a single executive like a president or a prime minister. They have what they call the board of 10 generals. But these are not generals just in the military sense. It's like a board of directors for the city, and it works pretty efficiently. Sorry about that. Now, let's talk about Rome a little bit. Who is that weird-looking dog and the people apparently suckling from the weird-looking dog? Well, the two boys are Romulus and Remus, two brothers who, according to legend, founded the city of Rome after being raised by wolves. And Romulus and Remus supposedly became rivals, sort of like Cain and Abel. Romulus killed Remus, who therefore never really got the opportunity to be an uncle. And Romulus is the namesake for the city of Rome. It is named after him, according to legend. Now, when you start having people raised by wolves, you do raise a few questions. Anyway, here is kind of a general Roman chronology before I tell you what it is that the founding fathers derived from Rome. The mythical foundation by Romulus and Remus supposedly takes place in 753 BC, and even if that is mythical, the year is probably pretty close to accurate. Rome was a monarchy from then down until about 507 BC. Well, we know the founding fathers don't want any part of that. In 507, it overthrew the last of the monarchs, and Rome became a republic. And we know the period from 507 down to 146 as the early republic, a period in which the Roman state was expanding into territory beyond Italy, and also in which the rights of Roman citizens were gradually increasing. Then comes the late Republic from 146 to 27, by which time the Romans had created a vast Mediterranean empire, even though we don't call this the empire just yet. The terminology can be a little bit misleading and confusing when you're talking about the Romans. Starting in 27 BC and lasting down to 284 AD, we have the period known as the Early Empire, where at least Roman historians acknowledged that they were ruling an empire, and where it was pretty obvious that men like the one you see in the picture there, Augustus, were emperors. Only they didn't call themselves that. They called themselves princeps, which simply means first among citizens or first among equals. So there is a sort of pretense that goes on through the early empire that the republic is still alive, and that the republic's institutions, which I'll tell you about in a minute, still are valid. The late empire drops all of that. There is no question that the later emperors are all powerful, that they are able to do pretty much whatever they want to, particularly in the 4th century. And so, they own up to being monarchs at this point. And once again, for that reason, are not terribly interesting to the founding fathers. The Roman Empire in the West falls in 476, according to tradition. It continues in the East, where it's often known as the Byzantine Empire, all the way to 1453, but that doesn't have much to do with our story. Now, which Rome is it that the founding fathers are interested in? Obviously, Roman history lasts a long time, and although it is best remembered now for the empire and the emperors, it was the founding fathers were much more interested in the republic because they were establishing a republic. And in the 1780s, after America had achieved independence, the conventional wisdom was that a large republic could not survive. Republics were supposed to be small states like Venice or Switzerland or what have you, but big republics were deemed to be impossible. Turns out that was wrong. But they drew a lot of hope from the fact that the Romans had had a republic for, over 500 years that had flourished, and, Rome was a pretty big state. So they looked at the period of the Republic for examples. And know what happens here. In 507, the Romans overthrew the last of their monarchs, a guy by the name of Tarquin the Proud, which you see represented in this illustration here. And here's what they created in its place. They set up a political system in which the administrative role previously exercised by the king went to two officials known as consuls. The consuls were chosen every year, and there were two to balance each other out, for one to keep the other one from doing anything crazy. There was also a Senate. That's where we get the term. The Senate was made up of people who came from what are known as patrician families, the big, wealthy, landowning families that had names associated with Roman history for a long time prior. There also was an assembly, a lower house, if you will, that consisted of representatives of the plebeians, that is, the lower classes. Now, you might say, well, this is not how it works anymore. The Senate are not patricians in this country, and the House of Representatives are certainly not plebeians. But the fact is, we often refer to the U.S. Senate as a millionaires club, because it is. Generally speaking, the people who are senators are richer than those who sit in the House of Representatives. Anyway, in the early republic, there are a whole series of political reforms, just like we saw in Athens, that gradually lead to a more participatory form of government. The plebeians outnumbered the patricians greatly, but the patricians were much more powerful. And eventually, the differential between those two groups began to shrink. And in order to keep the plebeians happy, in order to keep, to prevent there being full-blown rebellion, the patricians eventually agreed in 494 BC to the creation of a new class of officials known as tribunes. This is an interesting idea. These officials were designed to look out for the interests of the plebeians and for anybody really that might be oppressed by the government or by the patricians, and to redress any kind of wrongs that might occur. Now here's the catch. A lot of the early tribunes were, as a matter of fact, patricians. So they didn't necessarily always have the interests of the plebeians in mind. Nonetheless, it's a significant step. In 471, they created something called the Concilium Plebis, a council of plebeians, which gives them a greater role in government. And in 450, much as what happened in Athens a moment ago, the laws were written down. They're called the Laws of 12 Tables because supposedly it took 12 wooden tablets to write them down. They were, carved into wooden tablets. Now, this doesn't mean that the laws were particularly lenient. Just like with Draco in Athens, the laws remained fairly harsh, but at least they were written down. At least you knew what the law said now if you got into trouble. In 366, for the first time ever, there was a plebeian consul selected. And that's significant in and of itself. But what it also meant is this: when you served as a consul, after your service was over, you became a senator. And so the next year, we get our first plebeian senator. Now, it's not like that turned things around completely, but it is, again, a step. And in 287 BC, the fellow you see not particularly clearly in that image there, Quintus Hortensius, passed through something called the Hortensian Law. And here's what that did. Up until 287, if the assembly passed a piece of legislation and the Senate vetoed it, that was it. It did not become the law. After the passage of the Hortensian Law, if the assembly passed something, it became law whether the Senate approved it or not. Now, the Senate didn't like this. The patricians didn't like this, but it was a great victory for the plebeians. And you can bet your bottom dollar that somebody's going to try to reverse it before that's all over. Now, in the late Republic, what we see is a series of powerful men taking power to operate first on behalf of the lower classes or the upper classes. And this is not being Roman history and me having only an hour. I'm not going to talk about every single one of them, but I want to give you a couple of important examples. In 133, an individual by the name of Tiberius Gracchus became a tribune and attempted to carry out some pretty far-reaching reforms. So far-reaching that the Senate objected to them vehemently, and he wound up dead, and not exactly by accident. 10 years later, He was followed by his brother Gaius Gracchus, who also exercised a good deal of power to try to carry out some fairly dramatic reforms, and was actually a bit more successful until he, too, wound up being assassinated. Over the next century, there were a series of individuals who were military leaders who took power, some of them on behalf of the patricians, some on behalf of the plebeians. But eventually, around 60 BC, three of these generals, guys who weren't really necessarily friendly, but who were willing to work together to get power, wound up becoming what is called the first triumvirate. The first triumvirate means ruled by three people: Julius Caesar, Marcus Crassus, and Pompey. That is Caesar you see in the picture. Now, as you doubtless know, the first triumvirate came to grief. They all ended up dead eventually, partly from fighting among themselves and partly because people began to suspect that Julius Caesar was trying to make himself a king. He made himself consul for life. He made himself the supreme priest. And there was real fear that he was about to take the title of king when he was assassinated, very famously, in 43 BC by, among other people, his friend Brutus. Well, shortly thereafter, a second triumvirate formed, led by Mark Antony, a general named Lepidus, and the great nephew of Julius Caesar, whose name was Octavian. And the process sort of repeated itself. The three became rivals, and eventually Octavian eliminated his rivals and became the head of state. In fact, he took or was granted by the Senate the title of Augustus, which is an honor, and he began to use that name. And he was also given the title Imperator, which means a victorious general. You get using that title as well, and historians now regard him, Augustus, the former Octavian, as the first emperor. He, however, maintained that fiction that he was merely the first citizen and that the republic still existed, even though when he died, the Romans recognized him as a god. We don't generally do that with our ex-leaders here. So, if you get identified as a god, that's probably a sign that you're a little bit more than the first among equals. At any rate, for historians, 27 BC, the year he takes that title as Imperator and Augustus, marks the end of the Republic and the end of the period in which the founding fathers were most interested. Now, we have to turn just briefly to medieval Scandinavia. This is not tremendously influential over Americans, but they did know about it. In medieval Scandinavia, there was a representative body made up of all the members of a Scandinavian tribe, or later a Scandinavian kingdom, which sometimes met to decide important issues or even to choose a king on certain circumstances. And it had the rather interestingly generic name, The Thing. Nowadays, if you encounter a congressman who tells you that he's off to the thing, you'll probably figure he's losing his wit. But that would have been perfectly accurate for a member of this institution among the Scandinavians. It's not those things. Those are different things right there. Somebody's favorite things, but not really germane to this discussion, except as an example of my cheap attempts to get a laugh. This is the real thing, if you will. Originated in the pagan era in Scandinavia. It's found in Denmark, in Norway, and in Sweden. It can be both national or local. It met regularly. It elected the king for many centuries. It made law, and it functioned as a law court. So it really was the real thing. Closer to our own experience, though, is the Witenagemot or Witan that we find in Anglo-Saxon England. Witenagemot is just too much trouble, so Witan is what we normally use. It's Anglo-Saxon. It technically means a meeting of wise men. It was the older men in the tribe, or later on the older men in the kingdom. It too was both local and national. It too elected and advised the king down till the Norman conquest. The king could be deposed by the Witan if he was not doing a good job. But it's not really a parliament yet, so it's not strictly a forerunner of Congress in a direct sense, because the king is still the lawgiver. We have to get to a point, if we're looking for forebears, where these bodies are making law if we want to see them as direct forebears of Congress. However, it is a direct forebear of a couple of things you've seen in fictional depictions on your movie screen lately. It's a forebear of the Entmoot in Lord of the Rings, which is fictional, you know. It's also the forebear of the Witenagemot that one sees in the Harry Potter stories. The people that wrote these things do some history too. So you see, you read history, you write novels, you may get fabulously wealthy. You never can tell. If you do, remember me. All right, we start to move a little closer. After the Norman conquest of 1066, when William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, came over and conquered England and made himself king as William I, he introduced a council called the Curia Regis. And I say we're a little closer because we're not where we need to be just yet. The Curia was mostly advisory. This was made up of the barons who served the king. They no longer really elected the king. That was now hereditary. And the king was still the lawgiver. And there have been few kings in history with more power than William the Conqueror. But he was seen as obligated to take the advice of the Curia Regis, just as they were obligated to give it to him. Now, about a century after his time, we encounter the king, Henry II, played by Peter O'Toole, who is the man who created what we know as the common law. What that really means is that in his day, the royal law came to supersede all other forms of law, all local law, all law associated with the barons, even law associated with the church, so that it genuinely was common. And it applied to everybody in the same way. Everybody had access to the same courts. Everybody had same access to legal processes like the use of writs, which generate various kinds of legal action, juries, and so on. But the king is still the lawgiver at this juncture. He's the one that introduces all these reforms. But that is about to change. Under his youngest son, Henry's youngest son, King John, who's usually the bad guy in all those fictitious Robin Hood movies, something very real happened. His barons rebelled against him in 2015 and forced him to agree to a document which presumably was in better shape in 1215 than it is in this photograph. That is known as the Great Charter, or in Latin, the Magna Carta. Now, the truth of the matter is, you used to see in old textbooks that this was the forerunner of American democracy. That's putting it a bit strongly. The only people that benefited from Magna Carta initially were the barons. They were looking out for their own rights here. And by the way, if you saw the Russell Crowe version of Robin Hood, Robin Hood's dad didn't write it. They made that up, just like Robin Hood is made up. But here's what Magna Carta does that is significant for us. It puts limits on royal power. It institutionalizes the idea among English speakers that the power of government is limited. It also guarantees due process. You can't simply be arrested and put in jail without being charged with something and put on trial. You are entitled to due process of the law. Now, we guarantee that under something called habeas corpus, which is not written into British law until the 1680s, but it's already there in practice in Magna Carta. Another thing that it introduces is the idea of trial by your peers. What that meant in 1215 was that barons would be tried before a jury of other barons. But that has come to apply to everybody. So everybody has a right to trial by their fellow citizens. And it included what may seem a little bit harder to grasp. It said that any feudal aids granted to the king must have the approval of his tenants in chief. Now, let me put that in plainer English for you. Under the system of feudalism, there were certain occasions where the king's vassals, those who owed him homage and fealty, were required to give him money. And basically, kings had used that as a form of taxation. King John had abused it. And what Magna Carta says is that in the future, if the king wants money, he has to get the approval of his tenants in chief. That is, from people who hold land directly from the king. That makes sense because they would be the people putting up most of the money. But where this takes us is that in the future, succeeding kings began calling together their tenants in chief to ask for money, and those occasions become known as parliaments. The next phase in that is what we call the Great Council. John's son, Henry III, who ruled for a very long time, often called his tenants in chief together, where they bargained. Basically, he would get revenue. They would give him money in return for redressing their grievances, for addressing problems that they were having. And it's a quid pro quo. It's a trade-off. And sometimes these meetings were called parliaments. Most people at the English court in the 13th century spoke French. And to say talk, which is what you did at these meetings, you used the French verb parler. So a parlement is one of these meetings. 1258, a group of the barons tried to impose further limits on the king and give more power to these parliaments with something called the Provisions of Oxford. It didn't stick. And so a few years later, one very powerful baron by the name of Simon de Montfort waged war against Henry, took him prisoner, and actually created a parliament that had all of the elements of later parliaments: peers, that is, lords, knights representing the counties, and burgesses representing the towns. But by a year later, Simon de Montfort had been defeated and killed, so that he doesn't go any further with that experiment. But subsequent kings do. Edward II, or Edward I, I'm sorry, who some of you may know from the movie, the William Wallace movie, Braveheart, called parliaments frequently, sometimes including the clergy. And by this time, it had become established that the king was supposed to do what's called living of his own. That is, he was supposed to pay his own peacetime expenses from his own landed income. So you called parliament if you needed extraordinary revenue. In other words, if you were going to war. Well, Edward was constantly at war, so he was constantly calling parliament, and he would redress their grievances in return for revenue. but he also started doing something new. He began making law with Parliament by creating what are known as statutes. And at this point, Parliament has become a lawmaker. Parliament has become a true ancestor of the Congress. It makes law in conjunction with the king, but it makes law. Now, at this point, it is unicameral. That is, everybody sits together. There's one house, lords, knights, clergy, what have you. But in the reign of Edward III, we're going to move towards bicameralism, which is not what this picture might seem to suggest. Rather, it is a system in which you have two houses. Edward III was also constantly at war. He's the one who began the 100 Years' War. He faced a disease disaster that makes our current one look tame by comparison with the Black Death. He had an increased need for revenue, and so he was constantly calling Parliament, and it just became more convenient for the Lords to meet in one group and everybody else, the so-called Commons, to meet in another. And under Edward III, the Commons got the right to be the house that initiated taxation and that appropriated money. This is where money bills came from and still do. They also, late in his reign, developed a political procedure that we've gotten quite familiar with in the last 20 years, and that is impeachment. They impeached some of Edward's officials for not carrying on in a particularly honest way. Now, could they do that? Well, yes, they did. It worked, and it became part of the tradition. Now, let's talk about Henry VIII. That's not really him. That's some idiot dressed up. That's really him. Under Henry VIII, we have the English Reformation, where the English church breaks away from the Roman Catholic Church, and Henry sets up an independent Church of England. Now, I want you to think about this a minute. He does this through Parliament. That is, through going to Parliament himself, getting them to do these things, and then signing off on it when they do. And think about what's going on here. They are carrying out changes in religious doctrine and practice. In the 16th century, at a time when everybody believed that following the right doctrine and the right practice made the difference between going to heaven or going to hell. That's a pretty important difference. And if Parliament is legislating about that, what else could it possibly legislate about that would be any more important? Moreover, when changes in religion take place under his son Edward VI, his daughter Mary, and his daughter Elizabeth, again, it's done by Parliament. They are legislating about the ultimate destination of your soul. So this gives them enhanced prestige, and at the same time, their secular business also increased, particularly because the Tudors were often at war, and also because there is a commercial revolution going on. In the 17th century, the English have a civil war, one that they still obsess over just as much as we do ours. Parliament fought a war against Charles I, with whom they had had political feuds. He tried for 11 years in his so-called personal rule to rule without them. And in 1640, the Long Parliament proceeded to condemn him for all of this, and the upshot of that was civil war. A civil war which Parliament won and which led them to overthrow the king and to execute him in 1649. Over the next 11 years, England experimented with a republic. The only time in English history there's been one. This is called the interregnum because it's between reigns. They're a republic in which Parliament plays a very large role, in which there's a good deal of political radicalism, including people called the Levelers who wanted to create real democracy, a little ahead of their time. There was religious freedom for most people. The first time in modern history that more than one religion had been allowed free reign in a particular state. But ultimately, it descended into a military dictatorship led by Oliver Cromwell, which is always a risk. The interregnum eventually ended, the monarchy was restored, and yet, less than half a century later, there was another revolution of sorts when James II, who was Catholic in a non-Catholic country and perceived to be too absolutist in his thinking, was overthrown and replaced by his daughter Mary and his son-in-law William, who became king and queen and therefore got a college named for them. Parliament made a deal with them to recognize William and Mary if William and Mary would recognize a Bill of Rights, further limiting the power of the monarch, or the executive, if you like, and further enhancing the rights of the English people. This left Parliament in more control than ever before. They now control their elections. They now control their membership. They now controlled their agenda. And within the next few years, their power grew even more. John Locke, a political philosopher, laid out the idea in his two treatises of civil government that all people are entitled to life, liberty, and property. It's Jefferson that says pursuit of happiness. That there is a social contract between the government and the governed, and that if the government fails to uphold its end of the contract, you have the right of revolution. We still do, you know. We don't have full-blown revolutions anymore. We have elections. If we don't like the government, if we think the government is not maintaining its part of the bargain, we throw them out by voting for somebody else, which is a lot more peaceful. In the 18th century, the French philosopher Voltaire, a very popular guy all over Europe, popularized Locke with an emphasis on reason and individual rights and religious toleration. Sound familiar? Another French philosopher, Montesquieu, inspired by the British example, wrote something called The Spirit of the Laws, in which he talked about the separation of powers. Now, he wasn't exactly thinking President, Senate, House, but it's the same principle. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was in some ways a nut, nonetheless wrote something called The Social Contract, in which he argued that states should be governed by the general will, which could mean popular sovereignty, or in certain cases could actually mean dictatorship. The unreformed Parliament of the 18th and 19th centuries by now had a cabinet made up of a prime minister and other ministers. By now, it was possible to oppose the government, to be part of what's called the loyal opposition without being accused of treason. You know, if you're a Democrat, we have a Republican president, you can oppose him. If we have a Democratic president, you're a Republican, you can oppose him. And nobody thinks that you're a traitor because you do that. But the 18th century is really the first time that's possible in Britain. But there was still a lot of corruption, a lot of influence that was not necessarily licit, and most people still couldn't vote, although they could petition. By the late 18th century, you have a fairly dignified individual called Edmund Burke calling for more participation in government, and a total scoundrel who was nonetheless a real reformer by the name of John Wilkes, the namesake of Mr. and Mrs. Booth's son, John Wilkes Booth, both calling for reform. And in the New World, all of the colonies had little parliaments of their own, like Virginia's House of Burgesses. Most of them were bicameral. Their modeled on parliament gave them more legislative freedom, and they were largely ignored by the mother country through a process that's often called salutary neglect, and they wound up pretty much running things through the power of the purse. This process of salutary neglect continued through the 18th century. The Parliament passed all kinds of things like the Navigation Acts and the Hat Act and the Molasses Act to try to force more money from the colonies into the mother country, but the colonies just ignored it until the 7 Years' War. After the 7 Years' War, the British government demanded, through Parliament, that those 13 colonial legislatures ante up some of the money to pay for the war. And the colonial legislatures began to complain about taxation without representation. We don't get to vote for Parliament, so we shouldn't be taxed. When the Stamp Act was passed in 1765, there were riots. We didn't invent that this year. There was also a Stamp Act Congress that had two S's. In 1766, this worked so well that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but passed another act saying we can do this again anytime we want to. And they did in 1767 with the so-called Townshend duties, which led to an American boycott and further repeals, except for a tax on tea, which is why when boatloads of tea showed up in Boston Harbor in 1773, a bunch of New England patriots went on board, not football players, but actual patriots, went on board and threw it into the harbor. The British government responded with a series of acts that the colonists referred to as the intolerable acts. But the one that worried them most was that the government of Britain shut down the Massachusetts legislature. That was serious business. That is what led to the American Revolution. That began under the First Continental Congress, that continued under a Second Continental Congress, that implemented the early stages of the Republic in the Articles of Confederation Congress, and that wrote a Constitution in 1787 in which Congress was given a prominent role. I don't know why I've got two slides for that. The Constitution was ratified by creating a Bill of Rights based on the English Bill of Rights and the Bills of Rights in the 13 individual colonies. Congress was important to all of this. And in fact, Parliament and the American Congress went through fairly similar stages in the 19th century. They both ended the slave trade. They both carried out reforms that expanded the vote. In the early 20th century, they both gave votes to women, and eventually in the United States, they gave votes to African Americans. Now, let me wrap up by pointing out that everybody has an opinion about Congress, and there's nothing we like to make fun of more than Congress, unless maybe it's the president, or both. John Adams said, our second president, I've come to the conclusion that one useless man is a disgrace, that two became a law firm, and that three or more become a Congress. Thomas Jefferson said, if the present Congress errs in too much talking, how can it be otherwise in a body to which the people send 150 lawyers whose trade is to question everything, yield nothing, and talk by the hour? Abraham Lincoln said, being elected to Congress, though I'm very grateful to our friends for having done it, has not pleased me as much as I expected. Mark Twain, who had a lot of things to say about Congress, included in that list, suppose you were an idiot and suppose you were a member of Congress, but I repeat myself. Will Rogers said the only difference between death and taxes is that death doesn't get worse every time Congress meets. Ronald Reagan said, I've wondered at times what the 10 Commandments would look like if Moses had run them through the U.S. Congress. Now, the fact is, adults need to know the history of Congress. You need to be associated with a good Department of History and Political Science. Kids need to know it too. And think about this. First graders, these are the first American leaders they remember. This is yesterday for us. These are the only leaders they remember. These are the first leaders sixth graders remember. These are the first leaders 12th graders remember. And incoming freshmen in college and a lot of sophomores were not born when 9/11 happened. We all have a job, not just history teachers, keeping this knowledge alive. We can't depend on the news media to do it exclusively. We can depend upon Congress to keep records, which it does, and to have a library, which it does. But let's not end up like Demosthenes, a great speaker and statesman who nonetheless opposed Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great and lost, or the one exception to the rule in ancient Greece, the city-state of Sparta, which became a military dictatorship with 2 kings, a council of 30, an assembly, and 5 guys called ephors who really ran the show and who had no individual freedom. Perhaps it's Booth Tarkington's opinion about Congress we ought to be listening to. The only criticism that anyone has any business making against Congress is that it's too good for some of the men we send there. Congress is our great virtue, understand. The congressmen are our fault. In other words, we send them there. So, vote. Register if you've not registered. Vote in the next election. God bless America. Thank you for listening to me, and I'll see you around.